Welcome to the Crime Untangled channel. Today, we're diving into a spine-chilling case that will leave you questioning the quietest of towns. Our story takes place in 2008, nestled in the serene community of Willow Creek, a town where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. But beneath the surface of this idyllic setting, a dark and twisted tale was about to unfold. The events center around a seemingly ordinary housewife, a respected priest ensnared in a dangerous web, and a devious plot that spirals into murder. On July 4, 2008, the peaceful town of Willow Creek, Georgia, was shattered by a horrifying discovery. Police received an anonymous tip leading them deep into the woods, where they uncovered a body. What followed was an investigation that exposed a shocking story of seduction, deception, and cold-blooded murder. Stay with us as we unravel this tragic tale that rocked a small town to its very core. Like, subscribe, and comment on this video if you love uncovering the darkest mysteries of human nature. Father Michael Bennett was the heart and soul of Willow Creek, a man admired and trusted by everyone. With his calm demeanor and deep, comforting voice, he was more than a priest. He was a beacon of hope for the community. Every Sunday, the townsfolk gathered to hear his sermons, finding solace in his unwavering faith and genuine compassion. In his late 30s, Father Bennett had dedicated nearly a decade of his life to the church. He wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a counselor, a friend, and a source of strength for anyone in need. He knew everyone in the town by name, remembered their stories, and seemed to have a natural ability to ease the burdens of troubled hearts. To the people of Willow Creek, Father Bennett wasn't just their priest, he was their rock. But even the most steadfast individuals can fall. Little did the town know their beloved Father Bennett would soon find himself ensnared in a storm of seduction, betrayal, and unimaginable consequences. Elizabeth Harper was the picture-perfect Southern housewife. She was stunningly beautiful, deeply devout, and always impeccably dressed. To everyone around her, she seemed to live a dream life, married to James Harper, a successful businessman who adored her. But beneath the flawless exterior, Elizabeth harbored a secret that gnawed at her soul. James, for all his kindness and devotion, was infertile. For years they had tried to conceive, consulting specialists and praying for a miracle, but their efforts were in vain. The whispers of hope that once filled their home had faded into a deafening silence, leaving Elizabeth feeling empty and bitter. Outwardly, their marriage appeared perfect, but Elizabeth's faith began to twist into something darker. She convinced herself that James's infertility was not just a misfortune, it was a curse. To her, it was a sign that something sinister lurked within her husband, something that prevented them from creating the family she so desperately longed for. This growing bitterness consumed her, fueling an obsession that would lead her down a path of destruction. As Elizabeth's desperation grew, she turned to the church for solace. Her visits to Father Bennett became more frequent, and her confessions grew increasingly intense. At first, her words were simple, prayers for strength, pleas for guidance, and expressions of her frustration with her circumstances. But as time went on, her confessions took a darker turn. Elizabeth began to speak of curses, the devil, and the belief that her husband was somehow tainted. She poured her heart out to Father Bennett, painting herself as a victim of a divine punishment. Father Bennett, ever compassionate, listened with concern, offering words of comfort and prayers for her peace. But Elizabeth's confessions were not as innocent as they seemed. With every visit, she planted seeds of doubt and fear in the priest's mind. She spoke of her suffering, her faith, and her belief that only someone as close to God as Father Bennett could help her. Slowly but surely, she began weaving a web that would soon trap the unsuspecting priest in a scandalous and deadly plot. Elizabeth's manipulations grew more cunning with each visit. What started as confessions of despair and prayers for strength soon became something far more sinister. She began suggesting that perhaps God had a different plan for her, one that involved Father Bennett himself. Elizabeth spoke of divine intervention, hinting that maybe God had brought her to the priest for a higher purpose. Her words were carefully chosen, laced with subtlety and persistence. She implied that perhaps the only way to break the curse and conceive a child free from the devil's influence was through Father Bennett. At first, he dismissed these ideas, firmly holding to his vows and faith. But Elizabeth was relentless, chipping away at his resolve with every encounter. Father Bennett, torn between his sacred duties and his growing concern for Elizabeth's mental state, found himself increasingly vulnerable. Elizabeth played on his sense of responsibility, painting her pleas as a call for divine guidance. What the priest didn't realize was that he was being drawn into a meticulously crafted trap. One evening, Elizabeth made a bold request. She told Father Bennett she was at her breaking point and begged him to come to her home, claiming she needed spiritual guidance in the privacy of her own space. Hesitant but determined to help, Father Bennett agreed. When he arrived, the house was dimly lit, creating an atmosphere that felt unsettling. Elizabeth greeted him with a look of desperation, her eyes brimming with emotion. They sat in the quiet living room as she poured out her heart, speaking of her fears, her pain, and her belief that the devil was winning. She leaned closer, her hand brushing against his arm, her touch lingering. Father Bennett tried to pull away, reminding her of the boundaries that must remain intact. But Elizabeth's words were intoxicating, twisting the faith he had held so dear. She whispered that God had chosen him to help her, that he was meant to be the one to give her the child she had prayed for. Her words blurred the lines between morality and her dark desires. Surrounded by the dim light and Elizabeth's pleading gaze, Father Bennett's defenses crumbled. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his, and in a moment of weakness, he gave in. What began as a lapse in judgment quickly spiraled into something far worse. Elizabeth's calculated seduction had succeeded, and the consequences would be catastrophic. To Father Bennett, the encounter was a grave sin, a moment of weakness that he would regret for the rest of his life. But for Elizabeth, it was a triumph. Her plan had worked, and she believed she was one step closer to fulfilling what she saw as her divine destiny. What Father Bennett didn't know was that Elizabeth's intentions went far beyond seduction. She was determined to conceive a child, convinced that this baby would be free from the curse she believed James carried. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth began noticing changes in her body. She felt fatigued, nauseous, and emotionally heightened. At first, she attributed these symptoms to stress, but soon she allowed herself to hope. One morning, she took a pregnancy test, and when it confirmed her suspicions, she was overwhelmed with emotion. Elizabeth clutched the positive result, whispering prayers of gratitude. To her, this was no ordinary pregnancy. It was a divine miracle, a sign that her suffering and sacrifices had been part of a greater plan. But as the weeks passed, the voices in her mind grew louder, more demanding. They told her that James was a danger to the child, that his presence was a threat that had to be eliminated. Elizabeth's joy over her pregnancy was short-lived. The voices that once offered her comfort now turned dark and insistent. They whispered that James was a danger to her unborn child, that his very existence threatened the purity of the life growing within her. Slowly but surely, Elizabeth became consumed by these thoughts. She withdrew from her friends and neighbors, isolating herself in the Harper home. Her once devout prayers transformed into desperate pleas for strength to do what the voices insisted was God's will. They painted James as a malevolent force, and they made one thing clear: he had to be removed. Elizabeth was terrified by the idea of taking a life, but the voices reassured her, claiming that this was a righteous act. They promised her that by eliminating James, she would be protecting her child and ensuring that the baby would be born free of sin. The plan began to take shape in her mind, growing clearer with each passing day. By July 3rd, 2008, Elizabeth had convinced herself that the only way to save her child was to kill her husband. On the evening of July 3rd, Elizabeth prepared James's favorite meal, ensuring everything was perfect. As they sat down to dinner, she watched him closely, her mind racing as she waited for the right moment. When James wasn't looking, she slipped a powerful sedative into his drink, stirring it in carefully. James, oblivious to the danger, drank it down, smiling at his wife as he praised her cooking. It didn't take long for the sedative to take effect. James's eyelids grew heavy, his speech began to slur, and he struggled to stay awake. Elizabeth, feigning concern, guided him to bed, assuring him he must be overtired. Once James was unconscious, Elizabeth retrieved a knife from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle. The voices urged her on, growing louder and more demanding. They assured her that this was the right thing to do, that she was protecting her child from a man cursed by evil. With a deep breath, Elizabeth raised the knife and brought it down, over and over, each strike punctuated by the voice's chilling praise. When it was over, James lay lifeless on the bed, and the room was eerily silent. Elizabeth stood over his body, her breath ragged, her mind numb. The enormity of what she had done began to sink in, but before guilt could take hold, the voices returned. They reassured her, soothing her with promises that her child was now safe and that she had fulfilled her divine purpose. Leaving James's body where it lay, Elizabeth cleaned herself up and went to bed, as though nothing had happened. The next morning she calmly went about her day, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But by July 4th, 2008, her carefully crafted facade began to unravel. That morning, police received an anonymous tip about a body in the woods just outside of town. When officers arrived at the scene, they were met with a horrifying sight: James Harper's mutilated body, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the dirt. The gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through the small town, leaving its residents in a state of fear and disbelief. The investigation began immediately, and as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in Elizabeth's story began to emerge. She claimed James had been away on business, yet there was no record of any recent trips. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from the Harper home in the days leading up to James's disappearance. And when forensic evidence tied Elizabeth directly to the crime, suspicion turned into certainty. While the investigation was unfolding, Father Michael Bennett was battling his own demons. News of James's disappearance and the discovery of his body filled him with dread. He couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Elizabeth had been involved, and the weight of his own guilt was unbearable. Unable to stay silent any longer, Father Bennett went to the police. He confessed to his affair with Elizabeth and admitted his fear that the child she was carrying might be his. His confession added fuel to the investigation, shining a light on Elizabeth's increasingly erratic behavior and her manipulative tendencies. With mounting evidence and a key witness stepping forward, detectives pieced together the dark truth of what had happened. Elizabeth Harper was arrested on August 8th, 2008, bringing an end to the nightmare that had gripped Willow Creek. On August 8th, 2008, Willow Creek was rocked by the news of Elizabeth Harper's arrest. Police arrived at her home early in the morning with a warrant. By now, her pregnancy was unmistakable, her rounded belly a stark contrast to the horror of the accusations against her. Elizabeth offered no resistance as officers led her out in handcuffs, her expression disturbingly calm. Inside the home, investigators found chilling evidence linking her to the murder of James Harper. Among the discoveries were personal items belonging to James, including his wedding ring and watch, hidden in a box beneath their bed. More disturbingly, there were remnants of the ritual Elizabeth had performed in the woods, papers covered with strange symbols and unsettling notes detailing her beliefs about her child's divine purpose. The small town of Willow Creek, which had once admired Elizabeth for her beauty and devotion, now saw her in a much darker light. The media, captivated by the scandal, quickly dubbed her the Devil's Wife, turning the case into a nationwide sensation. The trial began on October 10th, 2008, and it quickly became the talk of the town and the nation. Every detail of Elizabeth's life, from her marriage to James to her relationship with Father Bennett, was dissected and debated. The courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to hear the shocking details of the case. The prosecution presented Elizabeth as a cunning, manipulative woman who had used her charm and wit to bend Father Bennett to her will. They argued that she had meticulously planned James's murder, luring the priest into her scheme as part of her twisted plan to conceive a child. The evidence against her was damning. Her fingerprints on the murder weapon, traces of James's blood in their home, and the ritualistic symbols discovered in the woods. The defense took a vastly different approach, pleading insanity. They argued that Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state, coupled with her inability to conceive, had driven her to madness. Medical experts testified that she had a history of psychological issues and that the voices she claimed to hear were a manifestation of her mental illness. The defense portrayed her as a deeply troubled woman who had lost her grip on reality. The turning point in the trial came when Father Michael Bennett took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he recounted his affair with Elizabeth and the events leading up to James's murder. He spoke of her manipulative confessions, her twisted beliefs about divine intervention, and his own moment of weakness. His testimony was raw and emotional, filled with visible regret and shame. The prosecution used his words to paint Elizabeth as a cold, calculating woman who had exploited the priest's vulnerabilities to achieve her own dark goals. The defense, on the other hand, argued that his testimony revealed just how unhinged Elizabeth had become, that her delusions were so strong she was able to manipulate even a man of faith. Father Bennett's testimony left the jury and spectators grappling with conflicting emotions, pity for a man who had fallen from grace, and horror at the extent of Elizabeth's manipulation. After weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict on November 15th, 2008. Elizabeth Harper was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never leave the confines of her cell. The courtroom was tense as the sentence was read. Some felt justice had been served, while others were left questioning whether Elizabeth was truly in control of her actions. Regardless, the verdict brought an end to one of the most scandalous trials in Willow Creek's history. Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy while incarcerated. Child Protective Services quickly took custody of the infant, placing him with a foster family far from Willow Creek. The boy, innocent of his origins, was given a new name and a fresh start. His foster parents hoped to shield him from the dark legacy of his birth, but the story of the Devil's Wife would forever linger in the shadows of his life. As for Father Bennett, he resigned from the priesthood shortly after the trial. Consumed by guilt and shame, he retreated from the public eye, seeking solace in solitude. Some say he left the country, while others claim he lived the rest of his days in quiet repentance. Regardless of where he went, his fall from grace became part of the tragic legacy of this case. The town of Willow Creek would never be the same. The Harper home, abandoned after the trial, became a grim landmark, a haunting reminder of the events that shook the community to its core. True crime enthusiasts and thrill-seekers often visited the area, much to the dismay of the remaining residents. Elizabeth Harper's story became a cautionary tale, whispered about for years to come. Some saw her as a victim of her own delusions, while others believed she was a master manipulator who used faith as a weapon. The truth may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: The dark shadow of the devil's wife will loom over Willow Creek for generations.